Scott. And I think as a perfect follow-up to Susan's last slide highlighting artificial intelligence as one of those future technologies, I would now like to talk about how we can use AI and how we are using AI today to unlock more resilience and more transparency in supply chains. Now, today's extremely global and interconnected supply chains are also extremely vulnerable to those shocks like COVID lockdowns, and I think we're seeing those effects still today. But also most recently the Ukraine war with shortages, production stoppages, questions around energy security, particularly in continental Europe, on the horizon. But there's also another trend that brings transparency to the forefront of the agenda, and that is the widening landscape of legislations and regulations around supply chain due diligence. The UK Modern Slavery Act really being one of the first quite narrow scope legislations, but in the meantime there's been a ton of new legislations coming online. Most recently the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act out of the US, requiring companies that are importing goods into the US to actually conduct due diligence around forced labor exposure to the Xinjiang region. But we also have the Norwegian Transparency Act, the German Supply Chain Act, and many others that are either already live or bound to become live legislation in the next couple of months. And all of those actually require understanding of the deeper supply chain and a way to analyze particularly human rights and environmental risks in those supply chains. But the picture at companies today looks quite different. I think 90% of companies that we talk to still use mainly static and reactive approaches to risk management. Around the stability of a supplier, they might use credit reports, internal KPIs around maybe supplier quality. Around ESG and human rights due diligence, they might use code of conduct, questionnaires. And around this crucial issue of multi-tier transparency, occasionally they use questionnaires, relying on their suppliers to provide this information. But what all of these approaches have in common is that while they are valid and not to be questioned fundamentally, they are still reactive and more or less snapshot information that we're dealing with. And they're not answering this really pertinent question, what risks are really happening right now and what risks are really affecting my supply chain on a day-to-day basis. And here we're talking about small-scale issues, and I think Susan also had it on her slides, labor unrest, accidents at suppliers, insolvencies at suppliers, but of course also these bigger scale events like geopolitical conflicts. And then we have this other category of risks around human rights, ESG compliance, child labor, environmental pollution, forced labor, and others. Lacking awareness around those critical issues in supply chains can have serious consequences. Production stoppages was one already mentioned, but there's also the reputational damage side of things. And of course, now with all of these new laws coming online, there's actually penalties over non-compliance. For instance, in the German Supply Chain Act and also the European draft, that will also affect UK companies active in Europe. It's 2% or up to 2% of annual revenues. It's actually similar to GDPR, quite stringent penalties. Now at Prewave, and this is now going a bit into the backstory of where we come from, we started working on this issue of how can we actually bring this transparency into supply chains already 10 years ago at the University of Technology Vienna. At the informatics department, we were thinking about how can we use AI and modern technologies to really make a difference here. And one of the breakthroughs for us came when we realized that most of those issues and critical risks are actually available in public data. We are producing more data than ever before, and many of those are available in those very local sources, local social media platforms, local regional newspapers. And that is where we basically come in with our solution. So today we use artificial intelligence that we developed already starting 10 years ago at the University of Technology Vienna to analyze those publicly available sources, so social media data, news media data, in more than 50 languages in order to get to those risks that are affecting our customers' supply chains on a day-to-day basis. One of our Reference customers is the Volkswagen Group. The Volkswagen Group uses Prewave since 2019 for several thousand tier 1 suppliers, but also for several thousand multi-tier suppliers. And this is actually the first step. It's a 4-step approach. The first step was actually to discover the supply chain down to the raw material level around 16 critical commodities. And these would be commodities like cobalt, leather, rubber, and commodities that are critical to the automotive supply chain. And I will get into how we do this discovery in a later slide, but right now what we then do as a second step is to monitor that supply chain with our technology and to provide highly prioritized risk alerting. So you can imagine if you're monitoring tens of thousands of suppliers, it's quite easy to be overwhelmed with the number of alerts and risks you would be highlighting. And this is precisely what we've been working on over these last 10 years, is how to narrow this down to a really digestible and actionable number of risks that we're highlighting. At Volkswagen, and this is step 4, for all of these tens of thousands of suppliers, we are highlighting on average 5 red flag alerts per week. And these would be alerts that then a team at Volkswagen follows up on. Follows up with the supplier, takes action on to mitigate those risks on a real-time basis. So out of tens of thousands of suppliers, getting to 5 actionable alerts per week is an achievement that we're quite proud of. During this project with the Volkswagen Group, they also did a benchmarking where they basically asked the question, so what is Prewave really finding and how good is it? They compared the alerts that we sent to them over a period of 1 year with information they received through other channels. This could be grievance mechanisms, whistleblower channels, findings from audits. And the result was that 95% of those issues from those more or less internal channels, we were also able to find in publicly available media data. But 50% of those issues more than 3 months before they received it through the internal channel. And the reason is that many of those issues in your supply chain, particularly around ESG relevant risks, they are well known on a local level at your supplier in South America, in Southeast Asia, wherever they may be, before they reach the central purchasing department, in this case in Wolfsburg. And we are kind of closing this gap, we are bridging this gap. But of course, risk management is much more than just highlighting risks, right? And therefore, we have been working very hard to move our clients and our solution along the risk management life cycle. So from using AI and alerting around identifying risks to also give them ways to actually evaluate those risks across all of their suppliers, right? Answering the question, so from all of my tens of thousands of suppliers, which ones are the ones I should focus on? Which are the most important ones? As a first step, we have implemented here a 360-degree scoring model that combines various types of data to arrive at an overall score for a supplier, a risk score in this particular case. We use country and industry scoring so that we can differentiate a supplier that may be active in the chemical industry in China with an elevated risk around health and safety issues or accidents from a services supplier somewhere in the UK with maybe a lower risk around those topics. Or we know based on regional awareness that this supplier is located in an earthquake-prone area. But we combine this with the first quarter of this chart, and that's the media score. And that is actually where we go back in time for each supplier and check them 5 to 10 years into the past to understand what has happened at that supplier in the last 5 to 10 years. So it's not just statistical information about, okay, it's a risky country, it's a risky industry. It's actually based on what has happened at that supplier. And those two types of information we combine into a cohesive risk score, in this case 47 of 100 points. And optionally, we can also add customer internal data. We can add audits and assessment results as well to the scorecard. And with this system, we are now working with customers to actually score their suppliers. And this allows us, because this is basically an automated process that uses AI, that we can score tens of thousands of suppliers in the matter of a few weeks. And this is, of course, what's critical to understand those risks and where are the hotspots in your supply chain. It's also critical around compliance with those legislations because those require you to run risk analysis, in the case of the German law, for instance, once per year, a risk analysis over all of your suppliers. And with this model, first focusing on country and industry risk, then focusing also on the media risks, we can run this analysis and basically arrive within, as I said, days or weeks at a map of those suppliers with elevated risks. And those would be then suppliers that we would suggest to take action. This is how it looks in the system. This is actually a screenshot from Prewave. What our customers end up with is basically a risk matrix, a classic risk and impact matrix, where we don't just highlight the risky suppliers, but we highlight the risky suppliers that are actually important to you. And they're important to you because they might be a single source supplier, because you have not a lot of stock with that supplier, it's hard to switch to another supplier. All of that, combined with a certain risk level, would move them up to the top right of that matrix. And those are then the ones that we focus on, and we actually recommend action to mitigate the risk with those suppliers. Qualify a second source, increase stock, all of those could be actions. And this then allows us to kind of close the loop, close the risk management lifecycle to not just identify risks, evaluate and prioritize them, but to also recommend actions to mitigate those risks and to provide dashboards to follow up on the progress and to actually see what is the impact of the actions you are taking. But that's all well and good, but now multi-tier. Yeah? So now going the step into the depth of the supply chain, because this is opening a new can of worms. Yeah? This is opening a new level of complexity, where we are not just doing this exercise around risk analysis for my first tier suppliers, but for the second, third, and fourth tier of suppliers. And this is, of course, super critical, particularly those regional risks that I highlighted earlier today, Ukraine, Taiwan. All of those issues are not just first-tier risks, they are really multi-tier risks. And it's important to understand what is your exposures on that level. And here we have an approach that also uses AI that combines various data sources to arrive at this transparency. And just like we do on the scoring side, we also do it on the multi-tier transparency. We start with public data. So we leverage public data to the utmost extent. Here we use customs and media data. I will highlight this in just a second. And we also predict supply relationships based on that public data. Then our customer has the option to actually add their own understanding, and in many cases our customers have some limited understanding about multi-tier suppliers around certain commodities they already mapped maybe some time ago. They can add this to the system, and then in the first step we approach suppliers to actually validate this information. But we never approach the supplier with a blank piece of paper asking them, please give us your suppliers, but rather we show them that we already know something. We already know possibly quite a lot, and we ask them to come on board to improve the quality of this information, to validate it. And that really gives us engagement also with the suppliers. Now, what publicly available data is there to get to this multi-tier transparency? On the one hand, we use media data. This is the same technology we use to identify risks in supply chains. We use to identify supplier-customer relationships. So there might be mentions around reference customers, press releases about supply agreements or key suppliers, or even we see it in annual reports, key suppliers are highlighted in certain areas. And that we can use and that we ingest and we load it into our systems. But the second source is actually even more important, and that's customs and bill of lading data. Around 30 countries in the world are publishing customs data. These are countries like the US, India, Brazil, Mexico, Ukraine, Russia, and many others that are actually publishing customs data. And based on that data, we get awareness around who is shipping what to whom. Millions of shipments that we have in our database that we can run analytics on and give our customers transparency into who their suppliers are. With that data, we are, for instance, running exposure analysis. This is the first thing we did after the Ukraine war broke out, is based on the first-tier suppliers of our customers, giving them an immediate report, where do your first-tier suppliers have exposures to Ukraine or Russia? So which of your first-tier suppliers are themselves heavily sourcing out of those regions? We have certain industries in the Ukraine, we have steel industry, we have cable harnesses and so on, and those issues were highlighted using that customs data. And most recently, we are doing the same thing around gas shortage exposure. So highlighting where are gas-exposed suppliers hidden in your supply chains. Your first tiers you might know, yeah, with some analysis many of you might have already done. Yeah. Which of your first-tier suppliers are heavily exposed to gas shortages because they use natural gas in the production process, either as a direct input or as a fuel to heat, basically, process heat in the production process. But we're going the next step because we have identified those most directly exposed suppliers, companies in the paper industry, ceramics and glass, plastics, petrochemicals, all of those companies located in those risk countries in Europe, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, and so on. But then we go the next step and we actually identify who are the most important customers of these suppliers. So, for instance, we see Nestle is actually buying a lot from gas-exposed suppliers because they're buying packaging materials, either plastics or paper packaging. And we see that they are actually quite heavily exposed to a gas shortage that might happen this winter. And here we have actually a general report, and I ask you to come by our booth. This general report is independent of your particular supply chains, but of course, we then also provide customer-specific reports once we know the actual tier 1 suppliers of our customers. And with that, I'm actually at the end of my presentation. I left the company introduction to the last slide. So as I founded in 2017, we currently are 60 employees, a bit more than 100 customers. You see some of the logos here. We raised 11 million euro Series A financing round, and I'm moving more internationally out of the German-speaking region of Europe, and I'm happy to be here, and yeah, looking forward to your questions if there are any. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harald. Really interesting to see what you guys are doing. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, could we get a microphone down here, please? I've got a couple of questions here that have come in from our virtual audience as well. I'll be back with you in a second. One here, what would be your advice to business leaders looking to add AI technology into their supply chains?
A bit self-serving advice, but the advice would be to not do it with your own IT departments. Yeah? Use off-the-shelf solutions that already have what you need developed and are standardized around this use case. We see it in many cases. The IT departments are creative, they want to do something, they sometimes have resources, and then they want to build something, but then it's never really where it should be, and they end up trying to develop solutions that others have worked on for 10 years internally, not getting them to the level where they want to be. So where you can buy off-the-shelf solutions, there's not just Prewave, there's many others. It's typically a better solution than, particularly when it's around external risks. Yeah? When you're working with internal risks, it might make sense to do something internally, but external risks, I think they can be bought off the shelf.
Okay. All right, could you start by saying your name, where you're from, please?
Yeah, okay. Michael Swan Procurement here.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It looks like a great product. I just got a question about the reliance on the social media aspect. How do you sort of ensure that the information is credible or fact-checked? Because obviously there's a whole load of stuff that gets put out there. Not all of it's true. So I'd just be interested to know how you filter that. Thank you.
Yeah. So of course, this is, like social media gives you a lot of opportunities because you can be more on the grassroots level, right? But there is these pitfalls as well, right? To all of a sudden be at the mercy of somebody writing 140 characters on Twitter. This is what we've been working on over the last 10 years, but to give you like the two main strategies that we have is, first of all, use AI to understand the relevancy of each individual post. What I mean by that is somebody writing on Twitter, my Siemens washing machine is striking. Yeah? Siemens, strike, but it's obviously completely irrelevant. That's the first use of AI. But the second use of AI is actually this is where I think it gets to your question, we are never considering just a single posting. Yeah? So when there's some, let's say, labor strike at a supplier, typically there's a bunch of Twitter posts, there might be some YouTube videos, there might be some actual news media coverage around it. And by combining these sources and understanding, hey, they all belong to the same issue, you can then derive a more credible alert out of this group of sources. Yeah? And if the New York Times is writing about it, it's probably legit. If 50 people are writing about it, it might also be more legit than if just one person is writing about it. So with that type of analysis, we can arrive at those alerts in a credible way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. Got another one here from our virtual audience as well. It says, how can you use AI to identify internal risks on contracts? So, for example, raw materials prices to be more proactive in your negotiations.
I mean, around pricing, yes, that is an important issue. We have a module that's called commodity monitoring, and that is actually where we allow our customers to monitor the risk development and price development around certain commodities they are buying. It could be really any commodity that you're purchasing. Could be steel, could be any kind of components that you're purchasing at large quantities. And if they're publicly traded on exchanges, as is the case for certain base metals, for instance, we're actually showing the price development and giving our customers also alerts when prices are bound to increase or dropping quite fast, because it's often the case that suppliers negotiate prices up when prices go up, but they don't negotiate down when prices go down again. I think we know this as consumers, but it also happens in the purchasing department. And we are also giving alerts around those topics. Not sure if that precisely answers the question, but that's what comes to mind. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Look, it looks really interesting platform for sure. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today, Harald.
Thanks,
you.
Scott. Thanks, everybody.